We are getting a sense tonight of how this anonymous op-ed from inside the Trump administration is ricocheting in Washington. One official telling the Washington Post tonight, quote, "The problem for the president is the author could be so many people." That's insightful. Eek. The Post says, quote, "The phrase, 'the sleeper cells have awoken,' has circulated on text messages among aides and outside allies." A former White House official telling the Post, quote, "It's like the horror movies when everyone realizes the call is coming from inside the house." Joining us now is Nicole Wallace, host of Deadline White House. She served as a senior official in the George W. Bush White House as communications director, and she was a senior advisor to John McCain during his 2008 presidential campaign. Nicole, my friend, thank you for being here.
Thank you for getting on the phone at 4.
Sure. We're right when this broke.
Right.
And you are sort of handling the enormity of this as it was emerging. A lot of people are talking about the fact today that this is something unlike anything else that's ever happened in any other White House. I mean, there was a lot of drama in the George W. Bush White House. There were former officials from the White House who left while President Bush was still in office, who wrote sort of damning books about their time. And anything like this?
So those were indictments of policy decisions. It was Dick Clark after 9/11 saying he jumped up and down and tried to warn the White House, the president, Condi Rice, about something 9/11-like. They were indictments of policies, enhanced interrogation or others. There was never anyone that came out and wrote an anonymous op-ed saying that the cabinet had talked amongst themselves about invoking the 25th Amendment. Never happened.
Yeah.
Never, ever, ever happened. And what's so extraordinary, and that piece from Ashley Parker and Phil Rucker and their colleagues is so interesting, because these are the kinds of things that people close to Trump have been saying since he was a candidate, since he was one of 17 candidates in the Republican primary.
The criticism of his character and his intellect.
The observations that he's not a man who reads books, that he's not someone who's curious, that he wasn't a particularly successful titan of business, that he essentially ran a family office and was television talent. People that were in the room on the day that the Access Hollywood tape came out didn't describe a man worried about embarrassing his daughters or his wife. It was someone trying to figure out, is that Trump? Is that me? Talking about himself in the third person. This is someone for whom sort of the rot of his own character is known by everyone in contact with him. No one thinks he's a good guy.
So this isn't a story of the president going nuts and somebody saying I started working for him because he was all right when he got elected, but something's happened to him in office and we need to sound the alarm. That's the context in which people describe mechanisms like the 25th Amendment or needing to have something like that available in the case of the president breaking. In this case...
Like the movie Dave. The president has a stroke, he's in the basement, you wouldn't need the 25th Amendment. That is not this.
Sure. It's not right. It's not like some presidents have been known to pick up the bottle at times in their administration. Right. So it's not something like that. Something was fine and now has not become fine. What you're describing, and it's consistent with my own understanding of the people involved here, is that this is the president is not seen as being any different than he was. And so why has this alarm been sounded now?
Because since the beginning, the people that have worked in the national security apparatus at the White House, and as I understand at the State Department and at the Defense Department and other places, have truly seen it as their jobs. And when pressed after something like Charlottesville, they were the ones on the phone saying, "You don't want me to leave. I hear you. I hear what you're saying about how we're all stained with the president's racism. But believe me, if you knew what I knew, you wouldn't want me to leave." And I understand that current national security officials say the same thing in private.
That they think they are there sabotaging the president's intentions.
They wouldn't say sabotaging. They would say
that saves the country from
preserving the country's national security.
But if you have to be there, or it doesn't happen, or the president will cause damage, then what they're doing is undermining and sabotaging.
It's a cover-up. And you should go to Congress. You should go to... I mean, the other problem is that the committees in Congress that used to be the bipartisan sort of security net, safety net for our national security agencies are broken. I mean, where would you go? Would you go to the House Intel Committee, where Devin Nunes is basically a Trump stooge? Where would you go? Yeah. I mean, if you were a whistleblower in the national security establishment at the White House, who would you call?
So, in fiction, when we confront these sorts of conflicts, people find wise men. People go talk to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, or they've talked to an upstanding cabinet secretary who seems to be outside the fray, or they find individual lions of the Senate or old hands in the House who can be trusted. And there's an informal sort of caucus of graybeards, for lack of a better term, who come together to make sure things land right. Is that real, or is that only in fiction?
I think that may have at one time been real when there were people like Ted Kennedy and John McCain who had a bipartisan relationship there. They may have been viewed as someone who could have sort of caught somebody if they felt like they were hurtling toward the unknown. But I don't know who that is. Lindsey Graham went from being present at John McCain's funeral to basically groveling before this president again in almost whiplash speed in a matter of hours, not days. So the idea that there's anybody on the Hill that you could go to that is seen as sort of a nonpartisan protector of our country's national security, I think is truly and sadly a fiction.
And so where this person has decided to go with this incredibly serious alarm is to the public.
It's to the New York Times, which, I mean, the decision to go to the New York Times is interesting, too. That is not a journal of sort of the right. But this
it's not where you go to speak to Trump supporters.
It's not where you go to speak. Well, you go to speak to Trump because we know he reads it. He rages against it. But this person sounds like a Republican to me. And he or she, I think he was described as a man, sounds like he's trying to speak to Republicans. What I don't understand is why Republicans, they now know from a person high up in the Trump administration, a political appointee, someone that may have worked on their staffs. You know, a lot of people in this administration came from Capitol Hill. They have now said that Donald Trump's cabinet, all political appointees, I think all Republicans by and large, have talked about invoking the 25th Amendment. Why there haven't been calls for congressional hearings, even if they're in secret, even if they're closed from the public right now. Every cabinet member should be called before a closed hearing to be asked what is at stake, what is at risk, as long as there are men and women in our military in far-flung places with their lives on the line.
Nicole Wallace, the host of Deadline, White House senior official and the George W. Bush White House senior advisor to John McCain, on the issue of whether the person is a man. That was from the New York Times tweeting out the op-ed, and it said he, an administration official. Then, so everybody's like, oh, it's a man. We can at least know it's not Kellyanne Conway, right? It's not like there's all that many women working in senior levels in the Trump White House. The Times later came out and clarified the person who wrote the tweet does not know the identity, or including the gender of the op-ed writer. So even though they'd given everybody that clue, they then were like, it's not a clue, it's not a clue.
Okay, so
it won't be long before it comes out.
Yeah.
Nicole Wallace, thank you, my friend.
Thank you,
Thanks a lot.
friend.
We'll be right back. Stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.